Sarah Bennett did not cry when the man she had just married turned his back and walked away without a single word. She stood in the middle of that Wyoming train platform with 40 pairs of eyes on her whispers, cutting through the cold air like knives, and she did not flinch. She picked up her worn suitcase, squared her shoulders, and looked out at the hard brown land stretching to the horizon. She had not come here to be wanted. She had come here to survive. And survival, she already knew, had nothing to do with beauty. If this story already has your heart beating faster, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that notification bell so you never miss a single chapter. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now settle in, because what happened next at Silver Creek Ranch will stay with you long after it's over. The letter had taken 11 days to reach St. Louis. Sarah read it 3 times at the kitchen table of the boarding house where she had lived for the past 2 years, working 60-hour weeks in a garment factory that smelled of machine oil and desperation. The handwriting was plain and purposeful, no flourishes, no romantic notions tucked between the lines. I require a woman capable of hard labor and practical thinking. The frontier demands strength above all other qualities. If you are willing to work and willing to adapt, write back. Beauty is not a consideration in this arrangement. That last sentence was the one that made her pause. Not because it stung, though she had heard crueler things said to her face and said with more pleasure. It paused her because it was honest. Thomas Whitaker had not tried to dress it up. He had not written the usual hollow language she had seen in other advertisements, the ones that promised companionship and warmth and a new life, while actually meaning they wanted a young, small, pretty woman who would smile and say very little. Thomas Whitaker had told her exactly what he needed and had made no pretense about what she was walking into. She respected that more than she would have respected poetry. She wrote back the same afternoon. I have worked factory lines since I was 16. I can cook, manage a household, keep accounts, and handle a difficult situation without losing my head. I am 25 years old. I am not small. I am not conventionally handsome. But I am not afraid of Wyoming, and I am not afraid of hard work. If that is what you need, I believe I can serve that purpose. She sealed the letter before she could second-guess herself. 3 weeks later, Thomas Whitaker sent her a train ticket. No declaration, no warmth. Just the ticket and a single line that read, "Train arrives Silver Creek on the 14th. I will be there." She had packed everything she owned into one suitcase. That had not taken long. The train journey was 3 days of rattling iron and dry landscape that grew increasingly unfamiliar. She watched the country change through the window, the soft green hills of Missouri, giving way to flat amber plains, and then to something rougher and more elemental, a land that did not apologize for itself. She found herself respecting it the same way she had respected Thomas Whitaker's letter. The frontier told you what it was from the very first look. It did not pretend. She slept sitting upright and ate the bread and hard cheese she had packed because she did not have money to spare on the dining car. An older woman across the aisle offered her a sympathetic look on the second day, the kind of look people gave Sarah, often a look that meant they had assessed her body and drawn their conclusions. Sarah smiled at the woman pleasantly and turned back to the window. She had stopped letting those looks cost her anything a long time ago. The train pulled into Silver Creek on the morning of the 14th, just as Thomas had promised. What Thomas had not mentioned was that apparently the whole town intended to be there to see it arrive. Silver Creek was not a large town. It had one main street, a general store, a saloon, a church, a sheriff's office, and a scattering of buildings that housed various enterprises she would learn the names of later. But every person in Silver Creek who was not bedridden or otherwise occupied seemed to have found a reason to be standing near the station platform that morning, and Sarah understood within the first 10 seconds of stepping off the train exactly why. They had come to see the mail-order bride. She heard the whispers before she reached the bottom step. A woman in a yellow dress said something to the woman beside her, something that ended with a laugh quickly swallowed behind a gloved hand. A man near the water barrel said, "Lord Almighty," under his breath. 2 boys of about 12 stopped their argument to stare openly. And from a cluster of men she would later learn were Silver Creek ranch hands who had ridden in that morning. She heard a voice say low and deliberate, but not nearly low enough. The boss ordered a wife and got himself a kitchen problem. Sarah stood on that platform and let herself hear every single word. She had learned over 25 years of being exactly who she was, in a world that had very specific preferences about what women should look like. That there were two ways to respond to moments like this one. You could collapse inward and give the crowd the shame they were looking for. Or you could stand your ground and refuse them that satisfaction. She had never once given anyone that satisfaction. She spotted Thomas Whitaker immediately. He was not hard to find. He was the tallest man in the group, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark hat and a working man's coat that had seen serious use. He was 40 years old according to the agency file, and he looked every one of those years honestly. His face was angular and weathered, the face of a man who spent the majority of his life outside dealing with things that did not cooperate. His jaw was set. His eyes found her at almost the same moment hers found him. She watched him look at her. Not with cruelty. She would give him that then and always after. He did not look cruel. He looked like a man whose calculations had just come back with an unexpected number. A man who was doing the mental work of adjusting his expectations in real time and who was struggling somewhat with that adjustment. She walked toward him without hesitating. "Mr. Whitaker," she said when she reached him. Her voice was clear and carried, and several of the people nearby fell quiet without meaning to. "I believe we both know this isn't what either of us imagined." He blinked. Just once. She thought she saw something move behind his eyes, something he was not prepared for and could not immediately name. "No," he said after a moment. "I reckon it ain't." "Then we're starting honest," she said. "That's something." She held out her right hand. He looked at it for a beat that lasted slightly longer than was comfortable, and then he shook it. His grip was strong, and his palm was calloused and rough as bark, and he let go quickly, as if he had not intended to hold on even that long. "Reverend Moore's waiting at the church," he said. "Lead the way," she said. The ceremony was exactly what she had expected. Functional, brief. The Reverend said the necessary words with practiced efficiency, and Thomas Whitaker said, "I do," in the same tone he probably used to agree to a cattle deal. Sarah said her own words clearly, without trembling, without looking away from the Reverend's face, because she had decided before she came that she would not treat this as something to be ashamed of, or something to be romantic about. It was a decision she had made with open eyes, and she would honor it with open eyes. When it was over, Thomas helped her into his wagon without speaking, climbed up beside her, and directed the horses toward Silver Creek Ranch. He did not speak during the ride. She did not require him to. She looked at the land instead and tried to learn its shape. The way the grass moved. The quality of the sky, which was enormous out here, larger than any sky she had seen before, almost aggressive in its size. The smell of the air, which was nothing like St. Louis clean, in a way that felt almost severe. She was going to have to learn this land. She was going to have to learn this man. She was going to have to build something real out of a transaction, and she had arrived knowing that the building would fall entirely to her because Thomas Whitaker had made it abundantly clear that he was providing the house and the legal arrangement and the purpose, but not the warmth. That was all right. She had brought her own warmth. She had brought it a long way, and she did not intend to waste it. Silver Creek Ranch emerged from the landscape gradually. First the fence line, then the outbuildings, then the main house, sitting against a ridge that caught the morning light and held it in a way that struck her despite everything as genuinely beautiful. The house was large by frontier standards. 2 stories, solid construction, built by someone who had intended it to last. But it had the look of a place that had gone untended for a long time. Not structurally neglected. The bones were sound. But there was a quality of emptiness about it, a blankness in the windows, an absence of the small human touches that made a building into a home rather than just a shelter. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop. "This is it," he said. "Yes," she said. "I can see that." He climbed down and reached up to help her, a gesture that seemed automatic. Something his mother had probably drilled into him, because his face did not suggest he had thought about it consciously. She accepted the assistance without comment and landed on solid Wyoming ground for the first time. "Your room's on the second floor," he said. "End of the hall. Cook's name is Hank. He handles the kitchen. You'll meet the hands at supper." "All right," she said. He picked up her suitcase before she could reach for it, which surprised her again, and carried it inside without elaborating further. She followed him through the front door and into the house that was now in the eyes of the law and the territory of Wyoming her home. It was worse inside than it had looked from outside. Not dirty in the way of genuine squalor, but dirty in the way of a place where no one had cared in a very long time. Dust had settled into corners and crevices. The floors needed oil. The curtains at the front windows had been bleached by the sun to something that might once have been a color. In the front room, a chair sat with a broken leg propped against the wall, as though someone had meant to fix it, and the intention had simply dissolved. There was a pervasive smell of unwashed wool and stale cooking grease, and something else underneath that, something sadder, the smell of a place that had given up on itself. Thomas set her suitcase at the foot of the stairs. "Supper's at 6, he said. "I'll be in the south pasture most of the day." "Mr. Whitaker," she said. He stopped. "How long has the cook been with you?" He thought about it. 2 years, maybe 3. "And how long since the household had a woman running it?" A pause. "My mother passed 7 years ago. There was a housekeeper for a time after that." "I see," she said. "Thank you." He looked at her as though he wasn't certain what she was thanking him for. Then he put his hat back on and went out the door, and she listened to his boots on the porch steps and the sound of the wagon moving away. And then there was silence. She stood in the front room of Silver Creek Ranch and looked around her. Then she picked up her suitcase and carried it upstairs herself. The room at the end of the hall was plain and clean enough, which was more than she could say for the rest of the house. A bed with a good mattress, a washstand, a chest of drawers, a window that looked out over the east pasture. She set her suitcase on the bed and stood at the window for a long moment, looking out at the land. Then she went to find the kitchen. It was worse than the rest of the house. The man named Hank was asleep in a chair beside the stove when she walked in. There was an open bottle on the table beside him. The stove itself had grease hardened on the iron in layers that suggested it had not been properly cleaned in months. The shelves were disorganized supplies mixed without logic. Several things she could identify as gone to rot or mold. A pot on the back of the stove contained something she did not care to examine too closely. Hank opened one eye when she came in. "You the new wife," he said. "I am," she said. "Sarah Whitaker." He looked at her with the specific kind of look she had already become an expert in recognizing, the look that was taking an inventory of her body and comparing it against some internal standard and finding the comparison unpleasant. Then he closed his eye again. "Supper's at 6, he said. "Same as always." She looked around the kitchen for a long, quiet moment. "What are you planning to serve?" she asked. "Same as always," he said again. "And what is that?" He waved a hand without opening his eyes. "Salt pork and whatever bread comes out of the oven." "I see," she said. She did not say anything else to him. She went back to her room, changed out of her traveling dress into her work dress, which was plain dark cotton with a full apron she could tie tight, and went back downstairs. She rolled up her sleeves. She started with the pot on the back of the stove, because the worst thing in a kitchen is always the right place to begin. She worked through the morning without stopping. She heard Hank wake up fully at some point, and heard him move around behind her, grumbling with the specific quality of a man who felt his territory being encroached upon. But she said nothing, and she did not stop, and after a while, she heard him leave through the back door. She found the small garden behind the kitchen house. It had been let go to a near disastrous state of neglect, but there were still things alive in it. Carrots, some scraggly beans, herbs gone leggy and wild. She gathered what she could. In the cellar she found a side of beef that had been improperly stored, but there was a good portion of it still sound. She cut what she needed with a steady hand and a butcher's knife she found on a shelf beside the back door. She had never been squeamish. Squeamishness was a luxury that factory girls and frontier women alike could not afford. By mid-afternoon, the kitchen smelled completely different. The stove was clean enough to cook on properly. The bread was rising in 2 loaves by the window. The beef was in the pot with carrots and onion, and the herbs she had rescued from the neglected garden. Slow cooking in the way she had learned from her grandmother in a farmhouse in Pennsylvania when she was 6 years old. A way that took patience and low heat and the understanding that the best things could not be rushed. She heard voices in the yard around 5 o'clock and went to the window to look. The ranch hands were coming in from the fields. There were 8 of them that she could count, dusty and tired, moving with the particular heaviness of men who had been doing physical work since before dawn. She watched their faces. She was good at reading faces. She had spent 25 years needing to know quickly and accurately whether a room was going to be hostile or neutral. These faces were tired first and doubtful second. Doubtful about her specifically. She had seen that too. She had seen it her whole life. She turned back to the stove and kept working. At 10 minutes to 6, Hank came back into the kitchen. He stopped just inside the door. The change in the kitchen was, she admitted silently, rather dramatic. Not just the cleanliness, though, that was significant, but the smell. She watched Hank's nose react before the rest of him did, watched him breathe in involuntarily, and stand there with something moving across his face that she recognized with a quiet satisfaction. That was hunger. Real hunger, the kind provoked not by an empty stomach, but by the memory of food that had once been good. "What in the hell?" he said very quietly. "Language, please," she said without turning around. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where'd you find herbs like that? That garden ain't produced nothing in 2 years." "It produced those," she said. "It just needed someone willing to look." The dinner bell rang at 6. She carried the bread to the long table in the dining hall herself, and went back for the pot and the serving ladle and the butter she had found at the back of the cold cellar. The hands filed in and stopped. Not all at once. One by one as they entered, and their bodies registered the smell. They stopped moving with a quality of stillness she had produced before in other crowded spaces, and always found quietly powerful. It was the stillness of surprise. She watched them from the kitchen doorway with her hands folded in her apron. A young hand, barely 20, sat down first and reached for the bread before anyone else had moved. He tore a piece, put it in his mouth, and his eyes did something that almost made her smile. The other sat down. She served the meal herself, walking the length of the table, filling bowls, setting the breadbasket at intervals so every man could reach it. Nobody spoke. Not a word. Just the sounds of eating, which were honest and uncomplicated and told her everything she needed to know. She was refilling the breadbasket at the far end of the table when Thomas Whitaker came in. He was later than the hands. He had clearly come straight from the field, still wearing his work coat hat in his hand, and he stopped in the doorway, the same way the others had stopped, but his stillness lasted a beat longer. He looked at the table. He looked at the men eating. He looked at her standing with the breadbasket watching him back. He sat down. She brought him a bowl herself and set it in front of him without comment and went back to the kitchen to check the second loaf. She heard nothing from the dining hall for a long time. Then she heard someone laugh. It was a surprised laugh, the kind that escapes before a person decides whether to allow it, and it was followed by another voice, and then another, and then the whole room had a quality. She had been listening for a low, warm human sound that had nothing to do with the food. Not really. And everything to do with what the food had reminded them of. They had remembered they were people. They had been working so hard and eating so poorly and living in such a joyless place for so long that they had half forgotten, and one meal had pulled it back. She leaned against the kitchen wall with her arms folded and listened to the men in the dining hall talk. Really talk. Not the clipped exchanges of exhausted workers, but the full conversations of human beings who had something to say to each other. And she thought, all right, this is where you begin. Thomas Whitaker came to the kitchen doorway when the meal was finished. The hands had drifted out, talking in 2s and 3s, a sound that she gathered was unusual in the evenings at Silver Creek Ranch. She was cleaning the pot at the washstand, her back to the door, but she heard his step and knew it was him by the weight of it already. She was good at learning people's sounds. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Whitaker," she said without turning. A silence. That was... He started and stopped. She waited. "Where did you learn to cook like that?" he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "My grandmother. She was a practical woman with a very large family and very little money, and she believed that a good meal was the closest thing to medicine most people would ever receive." I was holding his hat in both hands. She noticed he did that when he was in the house, held his hat the way some men hold things when they aren't sure what to do with their hands. "The men haven't sounded like that in a long time," he said. "No," she said. "I didn't think they had." "How did you know?" She turned back to the pot. "Because I looked at them. You can learn a great deal about a place just by looking at the faces of the people who live there." I was quiet for long enough that she thought he had left. Then he said, "What did you see when you looked at my face?" She set the pot down and dried her hands on her apron and turned to face him fully, for the first time since she had watched him look at her on the train platform that morning. "I saw a man who's been carrying something very heavy for a very long time," she said. "Alone." His jaw tightened. "And who isn't used to anyone seeing that," she added. He put his hat on. That specific gesture she was already learning meant the conversation was over for now. "Supper was good," he said. "Thank you." "You're welcome, Mr. Whitaker," she said. He went out. She listened to his boots on the floor across the front room up the stairs. The sound of a door closing. And then the house was quiet again, except for the sound of the wind outside, which was a constant presence in this country. She was already beginning to understand a voice. The land used to remind you it was always there. She finished cleaning the kitchen. She went upstairs to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while without lighting the lamp, listening to the wind and thinking about the faces she had seen at that table tonight. 8 men, plus their employer. All of them carrying the same weariness. Yes, all of them having momentarily set it down. She had done that once before, in the factory in St. Louis. In the years before she had decided to answer an advertisement from a stranger in Wyoming, she had done small things. Brought bread when someone was sick. Sat with the women on their lunch break and made them laugh. Organized small kindnesses in ways that didn't draw attention to themselves. She had always known how to find the human center of a place and work from there. Thomas Whitaker had written her that he needed someone strong enough to survive the frontier. She had not told him that she had been surviving far worse than frontier for 25 years. She had not told him that she had been surviving the specific cruelty of a world that looked at her body and made its judgments, and that she had learned to live so fully inside her own self-knowledge that those judgments bounced off her like gravel off iron. She had not told him that the women no one looked twice at were often the ones who kept the whole world running while everyone else was busy looking elsewhere. She lit the lamp. She opened her suitcase and took out the 3 books she had brought, the only luxury she had allowed herself, and stacked them on the chest of drawers beside the bed. She took out the small framed photograph of her grandmother, who had been a wide woman with strong arms and an uncompromising expression, and the warmest laugh Sarah had ever heard, and she set it on the washstand where she could see it from the bed. She undressed. She washed her face. She got into bed. The mattress was better than anything she had slept on in 2 years, and the pillow was clean, and outside the window, the Wyoming sky was doing something extraordinary, with the stars producing a quantity and density of light that she had never seen in the city, and that made her breath catch slightly despite everything. She lay in the dark and looked at those stars. She thought about the man down the hall holding his hat with both hands in a doorway, asking her what she had seen in his face. She thought about the hands laughing, surprised at themselves. She thought about the neglected garden with its stubborn survivors, still producing, still willing, just waiting for someone to look. All right, she thought again. This is where you begin. She slept. She was up before dawn. The second morning of her life at Silver Creek Ranch began the same way she had begun every morning she could remember, with purpose and without ceremony. Because Sarah Bennett had learned early that the world did not wait, and that waiting for the world was a luxury that belonged to other kinds of women. She was in the kitchen while the sky was still gray, relighting the stove, assessing the pantry with fresh eyes and a list forming in her head. She had learned the landscape of the kitchen the day before. Now she was learning its logic, or rather the absence of logic, and beginning to impose one. Hank came in at 5:30 and stopped when he saw her. "You again," he said. "Me again," she agreed pleasantly. He looked at the stove, at the clean surfaces, at the organized shelves she had already begun to impose order on. "This is my kitchen," he said. She turned to look at him. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at people who were drawing lines direct and unafraid and without aggression, because aggression was never the right tool here. "It is," she said, "and I'm not here to take it from you. But I am here to help run this household, and the kitchen is part of that. We can do this together or separately. Either way, the work gets done." He chewed on something that wasn't there. Then he said, "That was a decent supper last night." "Thank you," she said. "Where'd you learn the herb thing?" "My grandmother." Haimad a sound that was not quite approval, but was not quite hostility either, and reached past her for the coffee pot. She stepped aside to let him and went back to the shelves. They worked in the same kitchen that morning, in a silence that was not comfortable, but was at least not hostile, and she counted that as a beginning. The third morning she heard the argument before she reached the kitchen stairs. Hank's voice loose and blurred at the edges, in a way that told her the bottle was already open, and a younger voice she didn't yet have a name for, tight with suppressed anger. She came into the kitchen and two men looked up at her. Hank red-faced and affronted. A hand she had noticed at the table the night before, mid-20s, dark-haired, with the kind of straight-backed dignity that cost a man something to maintain. "Mrs. Whitaker," the young man said, and tipped his head. "Good morning," she said. She looked at Hank. The bottle was on the table. It was barely past 5 in the morning. "Hank," she said, "step outside a moment, please." "This is my—" "I know it is," she said. "Step outside anyway." Something in her voice, or perhaps in the steadiness of her face, made him move. He took the bottle, which she noted but did not remark on, and went out the back. She turned to the young hand. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't know your name yet." "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Cross." "Daniel," she said. "What happened?" He shook his head, a small, tight motion. "It ain't your concern, ma'am. I apologize for the noise." "It is my concern," she said. "This is my household, and you are part of it. What happened?" He looked at her for a moment, with the expression of someone running a quick calculation about whether to trust, and she kept her face open and waited. "I was drunk when I came in," Daniel said. "He burned the breakfast yesterday and told Mr. Whitaker the stove was faulty. I was there. I know what happened. I don't like a man who lies." She looked at the back door. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I'll handle it." "Ma'am," he said with a note in his voice that she recognized. It was the note of someone who has not recently been treated with the dignity that small phrase implied. "You should know," she said, turning to the stove, "that whatever I make this morning will be better than what you'd have gotten otherwise. Can you set the table before the others come in?" He blinked. "Yes, ma'am." "Good," she said. She heard him moving in the dining hall as she built the breakfast, and she heard the quality of the silence in the house change as the other hands came in one by one and smelled the stove and said things to each other in low voices that she could not quite make out but did not need to. Thomas came down at 6:15 and ate without speaking, as had been his pattern, but he stayed at the table after the others had filed out, which was not his pattern. She was clearing the far end when he said, "Mrs. Whitaker." "Mr. Whitaker." "Hank." She set down the stack of plates she was carrying and came to where he could see her fully. "I'm aware," she said. "He was drunk before 5 this morning." "Yes," she said. "This isn't the first time." His voice was carefully level, the voice of a man who did not waste energy on emotion when a fact would do the same work. "No," she said. "I didn't think it was." "He's been here a long time," Thomas said. "He knew my mother." She understood the weight of that. She said nothing. "But the kitchen," he said. "The kitchen can't run like this." "No," she agreed. "It can't." He was looking at the table surface. She watched him work through something that was clearly not a simple calculation, and she waited. "What would you need," he said, "to run the kitchen yourself?" "Authority over it," she said simply and directly. Not to take it from him if there's something else he can do here that serves him better, but clear authority over the household and the food. He looked up at her. "Done," he said. It was not what she had expected. She had expected more resistance, more deliberation, more of the particular slowness of men who did not like to acknowledge that a decision had already made itself. "Thank you," she said. He pushed back from the table. "I'll speak to Hank." "I'd like to be there," she said. He stopped. "I'd like to be there," she said again, steadier. "He needs to hear it from me as well. If you tell him without me, it's your decision. If I'm there, it's a fact of this house." Thomas looked at her with the same expression she had been collecting from him since the train platform, the expression of a man encountering something he had not included in his calculations and was not certain how to account for. "All right," he said. Hank took it poorly as she had expected, and took it loudly as she had also expected. He said things about women who came from nowhere and thought they knew a kitchen. He said things about her size, which she had also expected, and which landed with the same null impact they always did. He said he had served Thomas Whitaker's family for 15 years and was owed better than this. Thomas listened to all of it, and then said in the flat, certain way that she was beginning to understand was his only register when a decision was final. "Hank, you can stay on as the ranch hand you were before you took over the kitchen. The pay's the same. Or you can go. But Mrs. Whitaker runs the kitchen from today. That's the fact of it." Hank looked at her with a kind of venom she had seen before and found tedious. She met his eyes and waited. He left the room. He did not leave the ranch. She had not expected him to. Thomas walked her back toward the house after, and at the porch steps, he stopped. "He'll make trouble," Thomas said. "I know," she said. "You're not worried." She looked at him. "Mr. Whitaker, I've been walking into rooms full of people who'd already decided what I was before I opened my mouth for 25 years. A disgruntled cook is not a new experience." He was quiet. Then he said something she did not expect. "That must get heavy," he said. Just that, not a question, not a declaration, just 5 words that told her he had heard her more carefully than he had let on. She looked at him, this angular, weathered man with his hat in his hands and his ranch behind him, and she saw again what she had seen on the first day, a person carrying something very heavy. "Yes," she said. "It does." A beat. "Supper at 6, she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And just for a second, at the corner of his mouth, she saw something. Not a smile. Not yet. But the memory of one. She turned and went inside. She stood in the kitchen of Silver Creek Ranch and looked at the clean stove and the organized shelves and the bread already rising and the honest Wyoming light coming through the single window, and she felt something she recognized but had not felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter and more durable than happiness. The feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She put her apron on. She got to work. The trouble started small, the way all real trouble does. It was not Hank who fired the first shot, though she had expected him to. Hank had retreated to the bunkhouse and to his bottle with the specific dignity of a man who intended to make his displeasure felt through absence rather than confrontation. She let him go. She had bigger things to think about. It was Caleb Mercer who came at her sideways. She had noticed Caleb on the first day. The way she noticed all the people in a new place quickly and completely filing them by the thing she read in their eyes when they first looked at her. Most of the hands had graduated from outright mockery to something closer to cautious neutrality after the first supper. Daniel Cross had been quietly respectful from the beginning. An older hand named Pete, who said almost nothing, had nodded at her one morning in a way that meant more than a speech. But Caleb Mercer had never once looked at her without that particular curl at the corner of his mouth. The curl that said he had decided who she was and what she was worth and was not interested in any evidence to the contrary. I was 35, maybe 37, with the lean, weathered look of a man who had spent his whole life outdoors and was proud of it. He had been Thomas Whitaker's right hand for 6 years, and she could see it in the way he held himself around the ranch with the specific confidence of a man who considers himself indispensable. The first thing he said to her directly was on the 4th morning. She was carrying a crate of supplies from the wagon that had come in from town, heavy enough that she was using both arms and walking carefully when Caleb stepped off the bunkhouse porch and stood in her path with his arms crossed. "Let me ask you something," he said. She stopped, looked at him, waited. "You think cooking a couple of decent meals makes you something around here," he said. "You think the boss is going to keep looking at you like you've done something impressive once the newness wears off?" She shifted the crate in her arms. It was heavy, and she was not going to set it down for this conversation. "I think the boss hired me to run his household," she said. "I think that's what I'm doing. If you'd step aside, I'd like to get these inside before the butter softens." He didn't move. "You're temporary," he said. "Women like you always are. They come out here thinking they're gonna change things, and the frontier chews them up and spits them out. Always has." "Women like me," she said, and her voice was even and flat. "You know what I mean?" "I do," she said. "I know exactly what you mean. And I'm going to tell you something, Mr. Mercer, because I think honesty serves us both better than dancing around it. The frontier doesn't scare me. You don't scare me, and I'm not going anywhere." She stepped around him. He let her go, and she could feel his eyes on her back the whole way to the kitchen door, and she did not turn around. Inside. She set the crate down on the kitchen table and stood for a moment with her hands flat on the wood, breathing steadily. Then she began putting the supplies away. The second thing Caleb did was more deliberate. She discovered it on the 6th day. She had organized the supply records that Thomas kept in the front room, a chaos of papers and ledgers that she had been sorting through in the evenings, building a clearer picture of the ranch's resources and needs. Thomas had not asked her to do this. She had done it because she was there, and the disorder was costing the ranch money in the form of duplicate orders and missed accountings, and she could see it clearly and could fix it clearly. So she did. She was cross-referencing 2 ledgers when she found the discrepancy. A feed order from 3 months ago paid twice. An invoice from a supply company in Cheyenne for equipment that, as far as she could tell from the records, had never arrived. Small amounts individually. Patterns collectively. She sat with the ledgers for a long time that evening, going over the numbers methodically, the way she had learned in the factory in St. Louis, where she had kept her own counts, because the overseer's numbers had always been slightly wrong, and she had eventually understood that slightly wrong, repeated week after week, meant the workers were being shorted. She brought it to Thomas after supper on the 7th evening. Howe was in the front room reading a letter, and he looked up when she came in. "I need to show you something," she said. He set the letter down. She put the ledger on the table in front of him, opened to the page where she had marked the discrepancies, and she walked him through it. He was quiet while she talked, his eyes moving across the numbers she pointed to, and his face tightened in a way she had not seen before. When she finished, he said, "How long have you been looking at these?" "Since the 3rd night," she said. He looked up at her. "Why?" "Because they were a mess," she said. "And a mess in the records means money leaving through gaps nobody's watching. I've seen it before." "Where?" "The factory," she said. "The foreman was taking small amounts from 12 different line workers for 3 years before anyone noticed. By the time they did, it was a significant sum." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he looked back at the ledger. "You think someone is taking from the ranch?" "I think the numbers say that something is leaving that shouldn't be," she said carefully. "I don't know yet whether it's carelessness or something deliberate, but you should know." He nodded once, the sharp nod of a man absorbing information and already moving it toward action. "I'll look into it," he said. "I'd like to keep working on the records," she said, "if you'll allow it." He looked at her. "You know accounts," he said. "I kept the factory floor inventory for 2 years," she said. "It wasn't complicated. Neither is this." Another of those pauses. She was getting better at reading them. This one meant he was recalibrating something. "All right," he said. She took the ledger back to the kitchen table and worked until the lamp oil was low. Caleb found out about it 2 days later. She didn't know how, but the ranch was a small world, and small worlds had permeable walls, and she supposed she had not been particularly secretive about sitting at the table with ledgers. The specific way Caleb's expression shifted when he saw her cross the yard that morning told her that he had heard and that he did not like it. He came to find her mid-morning, She was in the kitchen going over the week's supply list when he appeared in the doorway with Daniel Cross, 2 steps behind him, and Daniel's face had the stiff quality of someone who had been put in a position he hadn't asked for. "Mrs. Whitaker," Caleb said, making her name a statement rather than a greeting. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Heard you been going through the ranch's business records." "I have," she said. "Mr. Whitaker is aware." "That right?" It wasn't a question. "You know what I think." "I expect you're going to tell me," she said. "I think a woman who's been on this ranch 9 days got no business poking around in matters that don't concern her." She looked up from the supply list. She looked at him with the full, direct, unhurried attention she reserved for conversations that mattered. "Mr. Whitaker asked me to help with the household," she said. "The financial records are part of the household. If you have concerns about my role here, you should take them to Mr. Whitaker." "Maybe I will," he said. "Good," she said, and looked back at her list. "Close the door on your way out. There's a draft." She heard Daniel Cross make a sound that might have been a quickly suppressed laugh, and then heard footsteps retreating. She did not look up until they were gone. Then she set down her pencil and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed for a moment. Just breathed because she was human, and Caleb Mercer's particular brand of hostility wore on her, the way all deliberate hostility wore on her, not crushing her, never crushing her, but costing something. She allowed herself 30 seconds. Then she picked up the pencil and went back to the supply list. That same afternoon, she heard Thomas and Caleb talking in the yard. She was not trying to hear them. The kitchen window was open because the stove was hot and the men were not far below it, and she heard Caleb's voice before she had a chance to move away, low and deliberate with the quality of a complaint long prepared. "She doesn't belong here, Thomas. I'm telling you as a friend. She came off that train, and in a week she's in the records and in the kitchen and everywhere else, and the men are already following her around like she's something special. That's not healthy." A pause. Thomas's voice even and quiet. "The kitchen runs better." "The kitchen," Caleb said with a specific contempt. "You hired a cook, not a manager. She's overstepping." "I hired a wife," Thomas said. Another pause. "You know what I mean," Caleb said. "Caleb," Thomas said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard before, a low finality that was not harsh, but was absolute. "She found discrepancies in the records. I'm looking into it. That's the end of this conversation." She moved away from the window. She stood in the kitchen, and she thought about the flatness in Thomas Whitaker's voice when he said those words. And she thought about what it meant that he had defended her, not with warmth, but with fact. And she decided that fact was its own kind of defense, and perhaps the more honest one. She got back to work. The discrepancies in the records deepened the more she dug. She was working systematically now, ledger by ledger, and the picture that was emerging was not carelessness. Carelessness was random. This was patterned. 3 specific suppliers. Invoices with slightly incorrect amounts. A second set of notations in a different handwriting that she had initially assumed was Thomas's, but which on careful comparison was not Thomas's. She sat with this for 2 evenings before she understood what she was looking at. On the 9th evening, Thomas came to find her. She was at the kitchen table with 3 ledgers open and a sheet of paper where she had been writing her notes when he appeared in the doorway. "You're still at it," he said. "I found something," she said. "Sit down." He sat across from her at the kitchen table. She turned the paper around so he could see it and walked him through what she had found. The pattern, the timing, the specific suppliers, the handwriting comparison she had made by setting the suspect notations beside a signed receipt she had found in the bottom drawer of the front room. Thomas was very still. "That handwriting," he said. "Yes," she said. He picked up the receipt and looked at it for a long time. "He's been with me for 6 years," he said. She did not say anything. "6 years," he said again, and this time the word had a different quality. Flatter, the specific flatness of a man. Absorbing a betrayal that he had not seen coming and was still not entirely certain he believed. "I could be wrong," she said. He looked up at her. "Are you wrong?" he said. She held his gaze. "No." He set the receipt down. In the silence that followed, she heard the wind outside, doing what it always did in this country, pressing against the house, reminding it of its presence. "There's a man," Thomas said slowly. "Edward Caldwell. He runs the Caldwell spread east of here. He's been trying to acquire land in this valley for 3 years. He made me an offer last year that I refused." He paused. "He didn't take it well." She was listening. "You think Caldwell is involved in this?" she said. "I think 6 years is a long time for an honest man to go dishonest on his own," Thomas said. She thought about that. He wouldn't need to go to him. Caldwell could have come to him. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Caleb has debts," he said, as though he was telling her something he had been avoiding knowing. "I knew about some of them. I offered to help him clear them 2 years ago. He refused." "Because he had already found another way to clear them," she said. Thomas stood up. He stood for a moment with his back to her, and she watched the tension in his shoulders and recognized it not as anger exactly, but as the specific pain of being made to revise something you had believed in. "Thomas," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He turned. "Whatever happened before I came," she said, "it happened before I was here. What matters is what we do now." He looked at her. "We," he said. "We," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically. Not in the large romantic way of stories. Just a small, precise shift, a loosening of something held very tight for a very long time. He sat back down. "Tell me everything you found," he said. She told him. They talked for 2 hours at that kitchen table, the lamp burning between them, and for the first time since she had arrived at Silver Creek Ranch, Thomas Whitaker talked to her the way he would have talked to a partner, without simplifying, without withholding, without managing what he said for the sake of her sensibilities. He told her about Caldwell, about the offer refused, and the conversation that had followed, which had not been pleasant. About a fire the previous spring in the northern pasture that had been officially ruled accidental, but that Thomas had always doubted. About 3 ranch hands who had left within 6 months of each other, which had seemed like ordinary turnover at the time. She listened and noted and asked questions when she needed to, and he answered them directly, and she understood that this was how Thomas Whitaker communicated best in straight lines with people who did not require the truth to be softened. At the end of it, she sat back and said, "He's not trying to beat you with force." "No," Thomas said. "He's trying to take you apart from inside," she said. "Financially and in terms of the people around you." "Yes." She looked at her notes. "Then we stop him the same way, from inside, from the records." "The records alone won't be enough in front of a judge," he said. "No," she agreed. "But they're the beginning, and there may be more. If Caldwell is running this kind of operation, Silver Creek won't be the only place." Thomas looked at her. Really looked at her. She felt it differently from the way she had felt it on the train platform. The first assessing look that had been a man taking inventory of his disappointment. This was something different. This was a man looking at a person he was genuinely seeing for the first time. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he said. She almost smiled. "The same factory. You spend enough years watching people with power take from people without it, you start to understand the methods." He was quiet. "Sarah," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She looked at him. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for the way I looked at you when you came off that train." "You don't," she began. "I do," he said. "I looked at you the way everyone else did. I'm ashamed of that." She held his gaze and let the words settle. "You're not the first," she said, "and I suspect you won't be the last." "That doesn't make it right," he said. "No," she said. "It doesn't." Another silence, this one with a different quality. Not the silence of 2 strangers navigating an arrangement. Something closer to the silence of 2 people who have found themselves in an honest place and are not sure what to do with the openness of it. "What do we do now?" he said. "We build a case," she said. "Quietly. Without telling anyone else on the ranch, because we don't know who else might be involved. We go through every record in this house, we establish a timeline, and we find corroborating evidence." "And Caleb," he said. She thought carefully. Don't confront him yet. If he knows we're watching, he'll warn Caldwell. Let him think nothing has changed. You can do that, he said. Treat him like nothing has changed. I've been doing it since I arrived, she said. He absorbed that. All right, he said. He helped her gather the ledgers into a single pile. I was careful with the papers. She noticed the way a man was careful with things that mattered to him without making a performance of it. At the door of the kitchen, he stopped. Why did you stay? He said. You came here on a train with no guarantee of anything. You got off to a crowd of strangers laughing at you. You could have turned around and gone back. She looked at him. I made a decision, she said. With open eyes. I don't walk away from decisions. He looked at her for a long moment. Good night, Sarah, he said. Good night, Thomas, she said. He went. She stood in the kitchen with her hand on the stack of ledgers, and she thought about the particular quality of his voice when he said her name, and she thought about his face at the table 2 hours ago, the way it had changed across the span of a conversation, and she thought about how she had not come to Wyoming looking for this thing that seemed to be edging quietly into the spaces between them. She had come to survive. She was beginning to think surviving was going to be more complicated than she had planned. The next 3 days were a careful performance. She served meals and managed the kitchen and organized the supplies and spoke to the hands with the same steady pleasantness she had used from the beginning, and she watched Caleb Mercer from a careful distance and said nothing to him that was not necessary and gave him nothing that was not professional courtesy. He watched her back. She could feel it. The specific quality of being watched by a man who was waiting for you to make a mistake. She had felt it before in other contexts, and she understood that the only effective response was to refuse to make one. In the evenings, she worked with Thomas at the kitchen table. They developed a rhythm. He would bring her information, names, dates, things he remembered from conversations that had seemed ordinary at the time, and she would place them against the records and look for correspondences. It was slow and often tedious, and occasionally revealed nothing, and occasionally revealed something. The 11th evening, she found a payment record that connected a specific invoice to a supply company she had never heard of. She looked up the name in the records. It appeared once in a ledger from 8 months ago. A significant sum. Payment for equipment. This company, she said, and turned the ledger toward Thomas. He looked at it and went very still. I know that name, he said. What is it? That's one of Caldwell's businesses, he said. He bought it 2 years ago, changed the name but not quickly enough. She looked at the entry, then she looked at Thomas. There it is, she said. He reached across the table and picked up the ledger, and she watched him read the entry 3 times with the expression of a man who had been waiting for the exact shape of the thing he had suspected and was now holding it in his hands. He's been billing the ranch for equipment through a company he owns, Thomas said. Equipment that was never delivered. And someone inside the ranch was processing the payments, she said. He set the ledger down. They looked at each other across the table. We need to go to the sheriff, he said. Not yet, she said. This is enough to start a conversation. It is not enough to end one. If we go now and Caldwell has a lawyer, he'll say the paperwork was a clerical error and we'll have shown our hand for nothing. Thomas looked at her. What do we need? He said. More paper, she said. And corroboration from someone outside the ranch who can speak to Caldwell's pattern. There are other ranches in this valley, Thomas said slowly. Men I've known for years. If Caldwell ran this scheme here, he likely ran it elsewhere. Then you need to talk to those men, she said. Quietly, without explaining everything. Just ask questions and listen to the answers. And while I do that, I'll keep working through the records, she said. There's more here, I can feel it. He pushed back from the table and stood, and she stood too, and for a moment they were both standing in the kitchen with the lamp between them, and the evidence spread on the table between them, and the weight of what they had found together, settling around both of them. Sarah, he said and stopped. Yes, she said. Thank you, he said. Not for the records, for... He paused, and she could see him choosing his words with the care of a man who was not practiced at this kind of speech. For not looking the other way. Most people look the other way. She held his gaze. Most people, she said, can afford to. He was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time since she had come to Silver Creek Ranch, Thomas Whitaker looked at her with something on his face that had no calculation in it at all. Just recognition. Plain, unadorned recognition. The kind that passes between two people who have found against all expectation that they understand each other. He picked up his hat. "Get some sleep," he said. "We've got work to do in the morning." "We do," she agreed. He went. She blew out the lamp. She stood in the dark kitchen for a moment, and through the window, the stars were doing what they did every night in this country, burning with a fierceness that still caught her off guard. A sky so enormous and so full of light that it made the concerns of any individual human life seem temporarily small. But only temporarily, because the concerns of human lives were not small. They were the whole of it. The betrayals and the loyalties and the slow hard work of learning to trust again. She put her hand on the stack of ledgers. Tomorrow she would find more. And somewhere east of Silver Creek, a man named Edward Caldwell was making plans that he believed were invisible. He was wrong. Thomas came back from the Henderson Ranch on a Thursday afternoon, and Sarah knew from the way he walked through the door that he had found something. She had learned his walk by now. Not intentionally, the way you don't intentionally learn the sound of rain on a particular roof. You simply hear it enough times that your body begins to register the difference. Thomas Whitaker walked with purpose at all times, but there were variations in it. The purposeful walk of a man who had accomplished what he set out to do. The purposeful walk of a man carrying a problem he hadn't left behind. And this one knew, which was the purposeful walk of a man who had gone looking for confirmation of something he feared and had come back with more than he bargained for. He set his hat on this hook by the door without speaking. She was at the kitchen table with the ledgers as she had been every evening for the past 4 days, and she looked up and waited. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and put both hands flat on the table. "Bill Henderson," he said. 40 years in this valley. Honest as the day is long." "What did he say?" she said. "He said he'd had 2 years of supply irregularities he couldn't account for. Said his bookkeeper quit on him last spring without notice. Said he'd always figured it was his own poor record-keeping." Thomas paused. "He pulled his ledgers out while I was there. Sarah. The same company name. Different amounts but the same supplier. The one I told you Caldwell owns." She pressed her pencil flat against the table. "How many ranches have you spoken to?" 3. Henderson, Jim Lattimore, and Frank Cole down at Bent Creek." "All 3. "All 3, he said. "Different details. Same pattern. Lattimore lost a good hand last year, man. He'd trusted for a decade. Couldn't understand why he left without explanation. Cole had a fire that destroyed 2 seasons of documentation." He stopped. "When you lay them next to each other." "It's a system," she said. "Yes." She sat back and looked at what they had laid out on the table between them over the past days. The neat stacks of receipts she had sorted. The timeline she had constructed on the single long sheet of paper that ran almost the full width of the table. The supplier name appearing and reappearing like a signature on something unsigned. "He's been doing this for years," she said, "across the whole valley. And nobody connected it because nobody was looking at more than their own situation," Thomas said. "Because that's how it works. You feel like a fool when your own books don't add up. You don't go talking to your neighbors about it." "But you did." "Because you told me what to look for." She looked at him. Howe was looking back at her with an expression she was getting better at reading, one that he didn't put on his face intentionally. One that appeared only when he had been caught thinking something he hadn't expected to think. "We need to talk to the sheriff," he said. "We need more than this first," she said. "We have a pattern, and we have a suspicious supplier. We need a direct connection. Something that puts Caldwell himself in the chain, not just his company name on an invoice." Thomas was quiet. "The ledgers alone could be attributed to clerical error," she continued. "A good lawyer in Cheyenne would have those charges dismissed in an afternoon. We need something that puts Caldwell's hand on it personally. A letter. A record of communication. Something. Where do we find that?" She turned the ledger nearest to her to a page she had marked 3 days ago and had been thinking about since. "This entry here," she said. "Payment authorization. 2 signatures are required on amounts over this threshold. See the second signature." He leaned forward and looked. "That's not my signature," he said. "No," she said. "It isn't. Which means someone authorized this payment using a forged signature or convinced the bank it was legitimate some other way. Either way, someone communicated with the bank directly to process this payment." Thomas stared at the entry. "The bank in Silver Creek keeps correspondence records," he said slowly. "They do," she said. "I grew up near a bank. My father kept records of every communication. It's standard practice." He looked up at her. "You think there are letters?" he said. "I think that a scheme this careful and this long-running required coordination," she said. "And coordination leaves traces. If someone was in contact with Caldwell about this ranch's finances, there is a letter somewhere that says so." The silence in the kitchen had a particular quality. The quality of 2 people standing at the edge of something that is about to become irreversible. "If I go to the bank and start asking questions," Thomas said, "Caldwell will hear about it within the day. This is a small town." "Yes," she said. "So we can't go to the bank." "Not us," she said. "But Bill Henderson is also a customer of that bank. And Bill Henderson has just discovered that his own records show the same irregularities. He has every right to ask the bank about his own accounts." Thomas was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "You want Bill Henderson to be the one asking the questions," he said. "I want Bill Henderson to go into that bank as a concerned customer asking about his own payment records," she said. "And I want you to be there as his friend who came along for the ride, who happens to look at whatever the bank manager shows Bill and happens to see whether any of those records match ours." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "You've thought about this," he said. "I've been thinking about it for 4 days," she said. Something moved across his face that she had not seen before. It was not admiration exactly, or not only that. It was something closer to the particular relief of a man who has been alone in a fight for a very long time and has just realized that today he is not alone. "I'll ride out to Henderson's first thing tomorrow," he said. "Good," she said. He didn't leave. He sat at the table with his hands still flat on the surface, and she could see him working toward something else, something he hadn't come in with, something that the conversation had led him to. "Caleb," he said. She waited. "If Caldwell has someone inside this ranch, and if that someone is Caleb—" He stopped. "I've known that man since before my mother died. He worked this land with me when it was nothing but struggling cattle and bad weather and nothing else." "I know," she said. "How do you do it?" he said. "How do you hold something like that alongside what the evidence shows?" She thought about it honestly before she answered. "You hold them separately," she said. "The man you knew and the man the evidence describes. You don't try to make them into the same person too quickly, because that's where people make mistakes. They rush to either defend or condemn, and both responses get the truth wrong." She paused. "The evidence is what it is. What you do with it has to be careful." He absorbed that. "Don't confront him," she said. "Not yet. Not until we have the corroboration." "What if he knows we're getting close? Does he have any reason to think we are?" Thomas thought about it. "I've been riding to neighboring ranches. He might have noticed." "What reason could you give for those visits that would seem ordinary?" "Cooperative grazing agreement," Thomas said without hesitating. "Henderson and I have been discussing sharing the northern pasture during the dry season. Caleb knows that." "Then that's your reason," she said. "If he asks." "And if he doesn't believe it?" She met his eyes. "Then we move faster," she said. She did not sleep well that night. Not because she was frightened, or not primarily, but because her mind was running the problem the way it always ran problems when she let it go. In the dark, covering the same ground, repeatedly checking and rechecking. Looking for the gap in her thinking that she might have missed in the light. The gap she kept coming back to was Caleb. She had been careful around Caleb. Deliberately ordinary. Professionally courteous, with nothing behind it that he could read as suspicion. But she was aware with the specific awareness of someone who had spent 25 years learning to read rooms quickly, that Caleb Mercer was also watching. And Caleb had an advantage she did not. He had been here for 6 years and knew the ranch in ways she was still learning. If he realized what she and Thomas were doing, he would not wait for them to finish. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about that. At some point before dawn, she made a decision, and the decision settled her enough to sleep for 2 hours, which was sufficient. In the morning, she found Daniel Cross before the other hands were fully awake and asked him quietly to come to the kitchen. He came looking mildly alarmed and sat down at the table with his hat in his hands. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need it to stay between us." He looked at her steadily. "All right, ma'am." "Caleb Mercer," she said. "You've been on this ranch longer than I have. How often does he ride out alone at night?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. She watched him decide something. "More in the past month than before," he said. "I noticed because his horse was tired in the mornings. Figured it wasn't my business." "Has anyone else noticed?" "Pete," Daniel said. "He don't say much, but he sees everything. He mentioned it to me last week." A pause. "What's this about, ma'am?" She looked at him. She made a judgment call the same way she had made them her whole life, quickly and from the gut, and based on everything she had read in a person's face and voice, and the way they held themselves under pressure. "I can't tell you everything," she said. "Not yet. But I need someone I can trust to tell me if Caleb does anything unusual. Rides out when he shouldn't. Sends a letter. Talks to anyone from off the ranch." Daniel Cross sat very still. "You think he's doing something wrong," he said. "I think we have questions," she said carefully. "And I think the answers matter for everyone on this ranch." Howe was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What happened to the money, ma'am? Last winter we all noticed the supplies were short. Hank blamed the supplier. Thomas believed him." She held his gaze and said nothing. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his jaw was set. "I'll watch him," he said, "and I'll tell Pete to do the same." "Thank you," she said. "You should know," Daniel said, rising from the table. "There are men on this ranch who would follow you before they'd follow Caleb Mercer. That's just the truth of it." She let that land. "I hope it doesn't come to that," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "But if it does—" He left. She stood in the kitchen and breathed. Thomas rode to Henderson's that morning as planned. He told Caleb it was about the grazing agreement. She watched Caleb's face from the kitchen window when Thomas said it, and Caleb's face showed nothing, which she was not sure was a good sign or a bad one. She spent the morning in the records. She had been through the ledgers 3 times now, and she knew them well enough that she had started to see things she had missed on earlier passes. Details that were individually invisible, but collectively spoke. The pattern of which invoices had been altered was not random. It followed a seasonal logic. The alterations clustered in the months when Thomas was most occupied with the cattle operations, spring calving, and fall roundup, when his attention was least likely to be on the books. Someone who knew the ranch's rhythm. Someone who had been watching Thomas Whitaker's attention for years. She wrote that down on her sheet of paper. She was cross-referencing dates when she heard the back door open. She assumed it was one of the hands. She did not look up. "Mrs. Whitaker." Caleb's voice. She looked up. Howe was standing in the kitchen doorway, and he had come in from outside, which meant he had come around the back of the house, which was not the direct route from the bunkhouse to anywhere he would normally be at this hour. She closed the ledger. Not quickly enough. She saw his eyes go to it before she got it shut, and she saw the quality of recognition that passed across his face, fast and controlled, but not fast enough. She kept her expression entirely neutral. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Didn't expect to find you inside," he said. "Thought you'd be in the garden." "I was," she said. "I'm inside now." He looked at the table, at the papers, at the closed ledger. "What are you working on?" he said. "Household accounts," she said. "Supply inventory for the month." "That's a ranch ledger," he said. "It is," she said. "Mr. Whitaker asked me to reconcile the supply costs against the household budget. If that's a concern, you're welcome to speak with him about it when he returns." The silence between them was a different quality now. She held it without moving. "You've been busy since you got here," Caleb said. His voice was still even, but it had a new layer underneath, something she recognized as a man choosing his next words very carefully. Real busy. In the records. In the house. In conversations you have no business being in. I have every business, she said. I'm his wife and this is my household. You're a woman he hired out of a catalog, Caleb said, and his voice had finally dropped the pretense of civility. You've been here 2 weeks. You don't know what this ranch is or what it took to build it. She stood up. She stood up slowly and deliberately, the way she had learned to stand in the factory when a foreman twice her age tried to make her feel small, and she looked at Caleb Mercer across the kitchen table with everything she had, which was considerable. Then you should have no trouble telling that to Mr. Whitaker when he returns, she said. Sit down with him tonight and tell him everything you think about me being in the records. Look him in the eye when you say it. Something flickered in Caleb's face. She saw it. It was fear, not of her. She did not flatter herself that it was of her. It was the fear of a man who has just taken a step further than he intended and realized the ground under his foot is not as solid as it looked. This conversation is finished, she said. I have work to do. He left. She waited until she heard the back door close, and then she sat back down, and her hands on the table were steady, completely steady, and she was proud of that. She picked up her pencil. Her hand was shaking. She set the pencil down and let it shake, and looked at the closed ledger and thought about the fear on Caleb Mercer's face and what it meant and how much time they had before he did something about it. Not long was her assessment. Not long at all. Thomas came back at 3 in the afternoon earlier than she had expected, and he came in through the front door fast with his hat already off and his face carrying the news before he said a word. Bill Henderson went to the bank this morning, he said. She was out of the kitchen chair before he finished the sentence. And the bank manager found 2 letters in Henderson's correspondence file, letters from the past 18 months, authorizing wire transfers related to supply payments. He stopped. Sarah, the letters are signed. Her breath stopped. Signed by whom? She said. Not Caldwell directly, Thomas said. Signed by his attorney, a man named Vickers out of Cheyenne. But here's what matters. The same attorney's name appears in the correspondence for 3 other accounts Henderson found access to, including one listed under Silver Creek Ranch. She pressed both hands flat on the table. An attorney means a paper trail that goes both ways, she said. Yes, Thomas said. Henderson photographed the letters. He has a friend who does it for the land office. Clear as day. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. How fast can you get a message to the county sheriff? She said. I can ride tonight. Don't ride tonight, she said. Send a wire from town, faster, and it leaves a record that we initiated contact. That matters legally. He looked at her. You've been thinking about the legal side of this, he said. I've been thinking about how to make it stick, she said. There's a difference between having the truth and being able to prove it in front of a judge. We need it to stick. He sat down across from her. She told him about Caleb's visit to the kitchen. She watched Thomas's face as she described it, the way the muscles along his jaw worked, the particular stillness that came over him when he was controlling something he did not want to show. He knows, Thomas said. He suspects, she said. There's a difference. If he knew exactly what we had, he would have done something other than come in and look at the ledger and leave. He's trying to assess how much we know. Which means he's going to communicate with Caldwell. Soon, she said. Daniel Cross is watching him. Thomas looked up sharply. You brought Daniel into this? I told him nothing specific, she said. I asked him to watch and report. He agreed. He's young, Thomas said. He's honest, she said. And he's been angry about those short supply runs since last winter. He just didn't know what to be angry at. Thomas was quiet. Then he said, What do we do if Caleb moves tonight? Then we move tonight too, she said. But Thomas, if Caleb rides out to warn Caldwell, that is also evidence. A midnight ride to Caldwell's property, witnessed by someone credible. She stopped. That changes the conversation with the sheriff significantly. He understood. You want him to run, he said. I want him to do what guilty people do, she said. Because innocent people don't ride out in the dark to warn someone. He looked at her for a long time. "I sent you a letter," he said, and his voice had changed completely, gone soft and off-script in a way that had nothing to do with Caldwell or Caleb or any of the evidence spread on the table between them. "I wrote to that agency, and I said beauty was not a consideration. I said I needed someone strong enough for the frontier." She looked at him. "I thought I was being practical," he said. "I thought I was setting expectations." "You were," she said. "No," he said. "I was apologizing in advance for not being able to offer more than a transaction. I was warning off anyone who wanted something real." He paused, and she saw the cost of what he was saying, the way it was costing him, the way honest things cost when they've been held back for too long. "I didn't think I had anything real left to offer anyone." The kitchen was very quiet. "Thomas," she said. "I'm not saying this well," he said. "You're saying it fine," she said. He looked at her hands on the table. Then he looked at her face. "You came here with one suitcase," he said. "You walked off that train in front of a crowd of people being cruel, and you didn't flinch. You've been in this house for 2 weeks, and you've changed every room in it." He paused. "Including rooms I didn't know needed changing." Her chest did something complicated. "I'm not going to be impractical about it," she said carefully. "We have work to do tonight, and we need to stay clear." "I know," he said. "But," she said and stopped. "But," he said. She looked at him. "Ask me again when this is over," she said. "Whatever you're trying to say, ask me when the work is done." Something moved across his face that she thought might be the closest thing to happiness she had seen there. "All right," he said. He stood up. "I'm going to send that wire," he said. "Good," she said. "Take Daniel with you. He can watch the telegraph office while you send it and make sure nobody who shouldn't is listening." He almost smiled. "You think of everything." "I think of the things that can go wrong," she said. "It's not the same." He picked up his hat. At the door he stopped. She expected him to say something further about what he had tried to say. He didn't. He was Thomas Whitaker, and he had said what he could say for one evening, and she respected that. "Keep the door locked tonight," he said. "I was going to," she said. He went. She sat in the kitchen for a long time after the sound of his horse faded. She thought about the fear on Caleb Mercer's face. She thought about the letters in the bank file with an attorney's signature. She thought about Thomas Whitaker at this table saying, "I didn't think I had anything real left to offer anyone," and the specific way his voice had changed when he said it, like a wall with one brick removed, just one but enough to see the light through. She thought about what came next, because Caleb Mercer was going to move. She was certain of it now. The question in a kitchen confrontation like that one was never whether a cornered man would act. It was only when and how. And Caldwell, when he heard from Caleb that the new wife was in the records and that Thomas had been visiting neighboring ranches, would understand that the game was closing. Men like Caldwell, when cornered, did not surrender. They escalated. She needed to be ready for what escalation looked like. She opened the ledger again and found the page she had been studying when Caleb walked in, and she read it again, and she saw something she had seen before, but now understood differently. A payment date. 11 months ago. The week of Thomas's mother's memorial service. The week when Thomas would have been at his most distracted, his most grieved, his least likely to be watching the books. She wrote the date on her sheet. Then she sat back and thought about a man who had used another man's grief as cover for theft, and she felt something move through her that was not the cold clarity of evidence gathering. It was anger, the specific clarifying kind, the kind that had always for her led somewhere useful. She picked up her pencil. She got back to work. Outside, the Wyoming night was pressing against the house the way it always did, enormous and relentless and indifferent to the small human dramas playing out inside it. But inside the kitchen of Silver Creek Ranch, a woman who had been underestimated every single day of her life was building the case that would bring down a man who had believed himself untouchable. And she was not finished. Not even close. Daniel Cross came to the kitchen door at 10:30 that night. Sarah was still at the table. She had not intended to still be at the table at 10:30, but the ledger had given up one more detail at 9 o'clock, and that detail had led to another, and she had lost track of the hour entirely, which was the way it always went when she was deep enough inside a problem. She heard the knock and was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand. "Ma'am," Daniel said when she opened the door. His voice was low, and his face was tight with something he was working to keep controlled. "He rode out, 20 minutes ago, took the east road." East. Caldwell's property was east. She felt the information move through her with the specific cold clarity of confirmation. Not surprise. Confirmation. "How long to reach Caldwell's land on that road?" she said. 40 minutes maybe, Daniel said, depending on the horse. "Is Mr. Whitaker back from town?" "Just came in," Daniel said. "I saw his horse in the yard." "Get him," she said, "right now." Daniel went at a run. She turned back into the kitchen and stood for exactly 3 seconds looking at the table, the ledgers, the long sheet of paper with the timeline, all of it laid out in the lamplight, with the patient coherence of truth finally assembled. Then she began stacking the papers carefully, deliberately, because panicking served no one, and the documents were the whole of this, and they needed to be protected. Thomas came through the front door less than 2 minutes later, with Daniel behind him and his coat still on from the ride back from town. "Caleb rode east," she said before he reached the kitchen. Thomas stopped. She watched him absorb it. Watched his face go through several things quickly. The confirmation of what he had suspected, the grief underneath it, that he was not going to let slow him down, and the decision, hard and clean, that landed on his face like a door closing. "How long ago?" he said. 30 minutes by now, Daniel said. "If he reaches Caldwell tonight, Caldwell will move the records," Sarah said. "Anything that connects him to the scheme. He'll have it destroyed or relocated before the sheriff can act on the wire you sent." Thomas looked at her. "What do we do?" "We can't stop Caleb from reaching Caldwell," she said. "We're too late for that. But we don't need to stop him. We need the sheriff to move before Caldwell has time to act on whatever Caleb tells him." "I sent the wire 2 hours ago," Thomas said. "Sheriff Briggs is in Laramie until tomorrow afternoon." She felt that land. "His deputy," she said. "Young," Thomas said. 22. Never handled anything bigger than a drunk on a Saturday night. She thought fast. "The letters Henderson photographed," she said. "Where are they?" "Henderson has the photographs. He's keeping them at his place. Who else knows we have them? Henderson, his bookkeeper, and us." "Then Caldwell doesn't know about the letters yet," she said. "Even if Caleb tells him tonight that we've been in the records, he doesn't know we have photographic evidence of his attorney's correspondence. He'll think we have the invoices and the supplier name. He'll try to explain those away." Thomas was following her. "He'll think he has time," Thomas said. "He'll think he has until Briggs gets back tomorrow," she said. "Which means he won't move the records tonight. He'll plan. He'll consult his attorney. He'll prepare a story." She paused. "We need to get to Henderson tonight and get those photographs to the deputy in Silver Creek by morning, before Caldwell realizes what we actually have." Thomas looked at her for one long moment. "That's 3 hours of riding," he said. "I know," she said. "You're not riding 3 hours in the dark," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I wasn't planning to. You are. You and Daniel if he's willing." Daniel Cross straightened his back. "I'm willing." Thomas turned to look at his youngest hand. Something moved across his face, a complicated thing that had gratitude in it, and something that might have been the particular pain of a man discovering too late which people around him were worth trusting. "All right," Thomas said. He looked back at Sarah. "You'll be alone here." "I know," she said. "If Caleb comes back." "I'll handle it," she said. "Sarah." "Thomas." She kept her voice even. "Go. Every hour matters." He held her gaze and she held his, and there was a conversation in that silence that was not about Caldwell or Caleb, or evidence that was about the two of them, which both of them understood, and neither of them had time for right now. He turned to Daniel. "Saddle the horses." Daniel went. Thomas turned back to her and picked up his hat from the table where he'd dropped it and stood with it in his hands. In that way he did, and she thought that she had learned that gesture so well in 3 weeks that it had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. "Lock the doors," he said. "Both of them," she agreed. "The rifle's in the front room. You know how to use one." "My father hunted," she said. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. Not amusement. More like the relief of a man who is leaving someone capable behind. "I'll be back by morning," he said. "I know," she said. He went. She listened to the horses leave 2 sets of hooves on the dry ground, quick and purposeful, fading east and then north toward Henderson's ranch. Then she listened to the silence they left behind. The house settled around her. She went to the front room and found the rifle where Thomas had said it was, and she checked it with the competence of a woman who had been taught by a practical man and had never forgotten the lesson, and she set it beside the kitchen door within arm's reach. Then she sat down at the table and went back to work. She was not going to sit in the dark being afraid. She had 3 things left to reconcile in the ledger. 3 small discrepancies that had been nagging at her for 2 days, and the night was long, and there was nothing she could do until morning but think, and she thought better with something in her hands. She picked up her pencil. 2 hours later she found it. She almost missed it. It was in the supply ledger from 14 months ago, buried in an ordinary list of feed and hardware purchases, a single-line item with a supplier name she had not seen before. A different company, a different pattern. Not one of the 3 she had been tracking. She stared at it. She went back through the ledger from that page forward. The new name appeared twice more in subsequent months and then disappeared. The amounts were smaller than the others, almost too small to bother with. But she had learned from the factory and from these past weeks that the smallest amounts were sometimes the most important ones. She thought about why a man running a large-scale fraud would also run a small-scale one using a completely different channel. Testing, she thought. He was testing. The smaller scheme came first 14 months ago. Then it stopped. And 2 months later, the larger invoicing scheme began. He tested it here first. He tested whether anyone was watching. And when nobody noticed, he scaled it up. The knowledge settled over her with the particular weight of a thing that is true and complete. She wrote it on her sheet. Then she sat back and looked at the full timeline she had assembled. The first test, 14 months ago. The escalation, 12 months ago. The memorial service timing, 11 months ago. The quarterly pattern through the spring. The 3 neighboring ranches. The attorney in Cheyenne. Laid out in a line like that, it was not a set of suspicious coincidences. It was a plan. A careful, long-developed, intelligently executed plan. And the man who had built it had believed he was looking at a room full of people who would never look back. He had been wrong. She set down her pencil. She closed the ledger. She sat with her hands folded on the table in the quiet kitchen of Silver Creek Ranch, and she thought about what morning would bring. She thought about Caleb Mercer riding east through the dark. She thought about Thomas riding north through the same dark in the opposite direction, and Daniel Cross beside him. She thought about Edward Caldwell somewhere east of here, about to receive a visitor who was going to tell him that the new wife was in the records and that something had gone wrong. She thought about what Caldwell would do with that information. Men like Caldwell, she had decided, were predictable in one respect. They always believed their intelligence was superior to everyone else's. It was what allowed them to run schemes like this one for years without getting caught. Caught the genuine belief that the people around them were simply not sharp enough to see what was happening. That belief made them dangerous, but it also made them vulnerable because it meant they consistently underestimated their opponents. Caldwell had spent years underestimating Thomas Whitaker. He had never known Sarah Whitaker existed. She picked up the rifle and checked it one more time and set it back down within reach. Then she blew out the lamp. Not because she intended to sleep, because a dark window gave less information to someone outside than a lit one. She sat in the dark and she waited for morning. It was Pete who saw Caleb come back. Pete, the old hand, who said almost nothing and saw everything, was apparently not a man who slept soundly when the ranch was unsettled, and he had been awake in the bunkhouse doorway since before dawn when Caleb's horse came in from the east road moving fast. Pete came to the kitchen before Sarah had the stove properly lit. She heard his step on the porch, specific and deliberate, and opened the door before he knocked. He looked at her with the calm eyes of a man who had been on the frontier long enough to have seen most things, and who had taken her measure in the first week and found it sufficient. "He's back," Pete said. "I know," she said. "What did you see?" "Horse was lathered, rode hard both ways." A pause. "He went straight to the bunkhouse, didn't unsaddle the horse properly, just tied it and went inside." "He's agitated," she said. "That's one word for it," Pete said. "Did he see you?" "I wasn't in a position to be seen," Pete said, which she took to mean no. "Pete," she said, "I need you to do something for me." He waited. "Don't let Caleb leave this ranch before Mr. Whitaker returns," she said. "I can't tell you everything yet, but I need him here." Pete looked at her for a long moment. "How do you want it done?" he said. "Wagon wheel needs fixing," she said. "Caleb's the best man for it. You could tell him Thomas asked for it done before he got back." Pete almost smiled. It was a very small almost smile, and it was gone almost instantly. "That's a good reason," he said. "I thought so," she said. He left. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the ranch waking up around her, the sounds she had learned in 3 weeks well enough to read like a language. The hands coming out of the bunkhouse. The horses in the corral. The particular rhythm of a morning that did not yet know what kind of morning it was going to be. She started the breakfast. She was not going to let the morning be anything other than ordinary for as long as she could manage it. Caleb came into the dining hall with the other hands, and she watched him from the kitchen doorway without appearing to, and she saw what Pete had told her confirmed in every line of his body. He was tightly wound. He ate without tasting anything. He looked at the door 3 times in 10 minutes. He was waiting for something, which meant Caldwell had told him to wait for something. She set food in front of the men and filled the coffee cups and said good morning to each of them by name, and kept her face exactly as it always was, open and steady and without a crack in it. Caleb looked at her once. She looked back at him with the complete pleasantness she had been maintaining for weeks and said, "More coffee, Mr. Mercer." He looked away first. She went back to the kitchen. Thomas and Daniel rode in at 7:45. She heard the horses and was at the front door before they dismounted. Thomas came up the porch steps with a leather satchel under his arm and his face carrying the particular quality of a man who has ridden through the night and found what he went for. "We have them," he said. She let out a breath she had not known she was holding. "Come inside," she said. Daniel took the horses. Thomas came into the kitchen and set the satchel on the table and opened it, and she looked at the photographs Henderson's man had made. Clear. Legible. An attorney's signature on correspondence authorizing payments from accounts that were not the attorney's to authorize. "These are good," she said. "Better than good," Thomas said. Henderson also found a letter that references Silver Creek Ranch by name, Caldwell's attorney writing to a contact at the Cheyenne Land Office about property acquisition. He mentions Silver Creek specifically. Her eyes went to him. "He was planning to acquire the land," she said. "After the financial collapse, he was engineering." "That's what it looks like," Thomas said. She sat down. She spread the photographs on the table beside her timeline, and she looked at the whole picture assembled, and for the first time since she had started this work, she allowed herself to feel the size of what they had found. It was not just fraud. It was not just a crooked supplier scheme. It was a systematic, deliberate effort to destroy Silver Creek Ranch and acquire its land at collapse price, and it had been running for over a year, and it had come very close to working. "Sheriff Briggs," she said. "His deputy Ellis rode out to meet him this morning when he got our wire." Thomas said. "They should be in Silver Creek by noon." "Caleb is here," she said. "Pete is keeping him on the ranch." Thomas looked at her. "You managed that already," he said. "Broken wagon wheel," she said. "He thinks you asked for it." He looked at her with the expression she had been collecting, the one she did not have a perfect name for, the one that was seeing her genuinely and completely, in a way that had nothing calculated in it. "Caldwell will be expecting something from Caleb this morning," she said, pulling herself back to the practical, because the practical was where they needed to be. "When nothing comes, he may move." "Ellis can have a man watching Caldwell's road," Thomas said. "He needs to do that before 10, she said, in case Caldwell moves early." Thomas nodded and stood. "I'll go to town," he said. "Eat first," she said. He stopped. She put a plate in front of him, eggs and bread, and the last of the cold beef from the night before. He sat back down and ate. She sat across from him and drank her coffee and did not say anything, and neither did he, and the quiet between them was not the quiet of two strangers navigating an arrangement. It was something else. The quiet of two people who have been through something together and have not yet had a chance to talk about what it has made them. When he finished, he set his fork down and looked at her. "I have something to say," he said. "Thomas." "It won't take long," he said. "Let me say it while I have the nerve." She held still. "I wrote you a letter that was designed to make sure you expected nothing from me," he said. "I wrote it that way on purpose, because I had decided that I was not the kind of man who had things to offer a woman beyond practical arrangement. That I was too far gone into this land and this work and this—" He stopped. Tried again. "My mother used to say this ranch had made me into a piece of furniture, useful and silent and without much feeling." She looked at him. "She wasn't wrong," he said. "But you've been here 3 weeks, and I have more feeling than I know what to do with, and I owe you the truth of that, even if I don't know what to do with it yet." The kitchen was very quiet. "Thomas," she said carefully, "we have a sheriff to meet, and a fraudster to stop, and a man in the bunkhouse who is about to have a very difficult conversation. Whatever this is—" She gestured between them, and felt the inadequacy of the gesture. "It will still be here tonight." He looked at her. "Tonight," he said. It was not a question. "Tonight," she said. He picked up the satchel and his hat. At the door, "Don't let Caleb leave." "He's not going anywhere," she said. He went. The morning stretched. She kept the kitchen running. She kept the hands fed and the household in motion, and she maintained the surface of ordinary so perfectly that even Pete, watching from the bunkhouse porch with his quiet eyes, would not have known from her face what she knew or what was coming. Caleb broke at 11 o'clock. She heard raised voices from the direction of the bunkhouse, and she came to the kitchen doorway and saw Caleb standing in the yard with Pete. And Caleb was done with the wagon wheel and wanted his horse, and Pete was explaining with elaborate patience that the horse needed the farrier's attention, and was that not something Mr. Whitaker had mentioned this week? Caleb turned and looked at the house. She met his eyes. He knew. She saw it happen. The specific moment when a man who has been running a calculation realizes the variables have changed and the answer is no longer in his favor. His face went through several things in rapid succession. Anger, and then a calculating stillness, and then something she recognized as a man deciding how far he was prepared to go. He took a step toward the house. Pete stepped sideways into his path without appearing to block him. Just a step. Just an old man repositioning himself in the yard. "Mr. Mercer," Pete said, "I think there's still the matter of the north fence post that needs—" "Get out of my way, Pete," Caleb said. Pete did not move. Caleb looked at him, at the steadiness in the old man's face, and behind Pete in the kitchen doorway, Sarah Whitaker standing with her hands folded and her face completely calm watching. Caleb stopped. He had calculated and come up with the right answer, which was that there were more people on this ranch watching him than he had realized, and that whatever he had thought was secret was no longer entirely secret, and that the woman in the kitchen doorway was the reason. He stood in the yard, and he looked at her with something that was past contempt and past hostility, something rawer and more painful than either of those. He looked at her the way men looked at the thing that had beaten them. She looked back at him without cruelty. She said nothing. He turned around and went back to the bunkhouse. Thomas arrived back at 2 in the afternoon with Sheriff Briggs and Deputy Ellis beside him. The sheriff was a compact, gray-haired man with a face that had the careful impassivity of someone who had spent a career not reacting visibly to things until he had all the information. He came into the kitchen, and she put the evidence on the table in front of him and walked him through it, the way she had walked Thomas through it methodically, without embellishment, starting with the first test entry 14 months ago and ending with the photographs of the attorney's letters. Briggs was quiet for a long time when she finished. Then he said, "Ma'am, how long did it take you to put this together?" 3 weeks, she said. He looked at the table. "I've had men on this job for 3 years who wouldn't have found half of this." "They weren't looking at the right things," she said. "What were the right things?" "The things that happen when nobody thinks anyone is watching," she said. "The timing, the patterns, the logic underneath the numbers." He looked at her with an assessment that was different from the assessments she was used to. "You've done this kind of thing before," he said. "Not exactly this," she said, "but close enough." He gathered the photographs carefully. "I'll need to keep these," he said. "They're yours," she said. He stood. "Caldwell's going to lawyer up fast," he said. "And Vickers, his attorney, is good. This is solid evidence, but it's going to be a fight." "I know," she said. "But the letters place his attorney's signature on transactions that benefited Caldwell's personal holdings. A good lawyer can do a lot of things, but he can't unsign a letter." Briggs looked at her. Then he looked at Thomas. Then he picked up his hat and said, "Mr. Whitaker, your wife is formidable." Thomas looked at her. "I know," he said. Briggs and Ellis went to the bunkhouse. They came out with Caleb Mercer between them 10 minutes later. She watched from the kitchen window. She watched Caleb walk with his shoulders in and his head down, and she thought about 6 years of honest work that had been traded for whatever Caldwell had offered him. And she thought about Thomas's face when she had first shown him the evidence, that flat, careful grief of a man revising something he had believed in. Caleb looked toward the house as they walked him past. She stepped back from the window. She did not need to see that. Thomas came in through the front door 10 minutes after the sheriff's wagon had gone, and he stood in the doorway between the front room and the kitchen, and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and for the first time since she had arrived in Silver Creek, there was nothing pressing between them, no emergency, no evidence to organize, no scheme to stop. Just the two of them, in the silence. He crossed the room and stopped on the other side of the kitchen table, which was still covered in the ledgers and the papers, and the long sheet with the timeline, all of it that they had built together over 3 weeks of evenings by lamplight. "It's done," he said. "It started," she said. "The legal process is long." "You know what I mean," he said. She did. "Thomas," she said. "The thing you were trying to say this morning." "Yes," he said. She looked at the table between them. Then she walked around it. She stood in front of him, with no table between them, and she looked up at him. This tall, weathered, angular man, who had written her a letter designed to promise nothing, who had looked at her on a train platform with a face full of adjusting calculations, who had come to her in a kitchen doorway 2 weeks later and asked what she had seen in his face. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her. "Sarah," he said, "do you think—" He stopped. Started again because Thomas Whitaker did not give up on something just because the first attempt was imperfect. "When I look at what you've done here, not just the evidence, this house, these men, what you've given back to this place just by being in it." He paused. "I want to know if you think this could become another stop. I want to know if you're still here because of a train ticket, or for another reason." She held his gaze. "I've been here for another reason since approximately the 3rd morning," she said. "When you came to find me about Hank, and you listened to everything I said, and then you acted on it. A man who listens is not common. A man who acts on what he hears is rarer still." He was very still. "I'm not an easy man," he said. "I'm not a small woman," she said. "In any sense. And I don't intend to make myself smaller." "I know," he said. "I don't want you smaller." He said it simply and without ornament, and she believed him completely. "Then we're honest with each other," she said. "That's where we start." He reached out and he took her hand. His hand was calloused and warm and held on with the steadiness of a man who did not reach for things lightly, but once reaching, did not let go. She held on back. Outside Silver Creek Ranch went about its afternoon. The horses in the corral, the cattle in the far pasture, the wind doing what it always did, the sky enormous overhead with its particular Wyoming brightness, indifferent and beautiful and enormous. Inside the kitchen, 2 people stood with their hands clasped across a table covered in evidence, having just dismantled a plan that had been designed to destroy everything around them, and built something neither of them had sent for. The legal process was as Sheriff Briggs had promised, a fight. Edward Caldwell hired the best attorney in Cheyenne, a man named Hargrove, who arrived in Silver Creek 3 days after the arrest, wearing a coat that cost more than most men in the valley made in a month, and who immediately began the work of dismantling what Sarah had built. He filed motions. He challenged the provenance of the photographs. He produced alternative explanations for every invoice, clerical errors, miscommunications, the ordinary chaos of a large operations bookkeeping. How was good. Sarah sat in the front room of Silver Creek Ranch on the 4th evening after the arrest and listened to Thomas read her the deputy's account of Hargrove's latest filing, and she felt the specific familiar anger of watching a man with resources use those resources to obscure something that was plainly true. She had felt that anger before, in the factory, at the boarding house, at every point in her life where the plain truth of a thing had been less powerful than the money surrounding the lie. She let herself feel it for exactly as long as it was useful. Then she said, "The test entry." Thomas looked up from the paper. "The first entry," she said. 14 months ago, the smaller scheme he used to test whether anyone was watching. That company name is completely separate from the others. Hargrove doesn't know we have it because it didn't appear in the documents we gave the sheriff." Thomas set the paper down. "You held it back," he said. "I didn't plan to," she said honestly. "I found it the night you rode to Henderson's after you left. I meant to include it in the sheriff's packet, and then I thought—" She paused, choosing the words carefully. "I thought that if everything went to Briggs at once, and Hargrove saw the full picture immediately, he could build a defense around the complete pattern. If we give him the pattern in stages, he builds a defense, and then we show him there's more." The floor keeps dropping. Thomas was quiet. "You've been sitting on this for 4 days, he said. "I've been waiting for the right moment," she said. "Which is when Hargrove thinks he's winning." Thomas looked at her. "Does Briggs know?" "Not yet," she said. "I need to tell him tomorrow, but I wanted to tell you first." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the thing moving in his face that she had learned to read over these weeks. The recalibration, the constant quiet recalibration of a man who had expected one thing and kept receiving another. "Sarah," he said. "It's not deception," she said. "It's strategy. There's a difference." "I know there is," he said. "I was going to say thank you." She held his gaze. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Let's see if it works first." It worked. She went to Briggs the next morning and laid out the 14th month entry with its separate company name and its distinct pattern, and she watched Briggs's face do the thing she had hoped for, the slow revelation of a man seeing a puzzle piece that changed the shape of everything around it. "He ran a test," Briggs said. "Yes," she said. "A smaller amount, a completely different channel 14 months before the larger scheme began. If Hargrove knows about the invoices and the attorney's letters, he has a prepared story for all of them. He does not have a prepared story for this, because this predates the story he's built." Briggs looked at the entry. "This puts Caldwell in a pattern of deliberate fraud rather than opportunistic error," he said. "A man doesn't test a scheme and then claim the subsequent scheme was accidental." "No," she said. "He doesn't." Briggs sent a wire to Cheyenne that afternoon. 3 days later, Hargrove withdrew 2 of his 4 motions. The valley noticed. That was the thing about small places Sarah was learning. They had their own kind of memory and their own kind of justice, slower than the law and less formal, but real. The ranchers who had met with Thomas in those careful, quiet conversations, Henderson and Lattimore and Cole, they had been watching. Their wives had been watching. The hands from 4 different ranches who had been comparing notes in the saloon on Saturday nights for years without knowing they were comparing evidence they had been watching. When Hargrove's motions fell, it was not just a legal development, it was a public declaration. Bill Henderson came to Silver Creek Ranch on a Tuesday morning with his wife Margaret and a smoked ham and the air of a man who had something specific to say. Sarah met them on the porch. Margaret Henderson was 60 years old and had been on the frontier for 40 of them, and she looked at Sarah with eyes that had the particular warmth of a woman who recognizes competence when she sees it and is not threatened by it. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said, and took Sarah's hand in both of hers. "I want you to know that Bill told me everything. About the records and the photographs and what you figured out." She paused. "We've been losing money to that man for 2 years and feeling like fools about it. You gave us back our dignity, along with our evidence." Sarah looked at her. "You would have found it," Sarah said. "You just needed someone to look at it fresh." "Maybe," Margaret said. "But you're the one who looked." It was the first of several conversations like that one. Jim Lattimore's foreman came by the following week and spent an hour at the kitchen table with Thomas. And before he left, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and said to Sarah simply, "Ma'am, I owe you a debt." And she said simply, "No, you don't." And he nodded once and left. And she stood in the kitchen for a moment, afterward feeling the weight of it, not uncomfortably, but fully, the way you feel the weight of something that is real. The trial date was set for late November. In the meantime, Silver Creek Ranch moved into the rhythms of late summer and early fall, which were the rhythms of hard work and long days, and the particular quality of life on the frontier that Sarah had come to understand was not romantic, but was real in a way that very few things in her previous life had been. The garden behind the kitchen house became under her attention something substantial. She had started with the scraggly survivors she had found on her first day, the carrots and the overgrown herbs, and she had worked outward from there, with the same methodical patience she applied to everything. Adding beds, amending the soil, planting what the altitude and the season would support. By mid-August, it was producing in a way that noticeably changed the quality of what came out of the kitchen, and the kitchen continued to be the center of the ranch's human life, in the way it had been since that first supper. The hands ate well. They talked at meals. They stayed. There was no dramatic announcement of this, no moment, when anyone acknowledged that the atmosphere of Silver Creek Ranch had fundamentally shifted. It simply had. The way a room changes when someone opens a window in it. The change is specific and real, but you'd be hard-pressed to explain it to someone who hadn't been there before and after. Thomas noticed everything. He said very little about it, which was his way, but she was good at reading what Thomas Whitaker said in silence. The specific way he paused at the kitchen doorway some mornings when the room was full of men talking over breakfast. The way he moved through the house differently now, less like a man passing through a functional space, and more like a man inhabiting a home. He had told her once that his mother used to say the ranch had made him into a piece of furniture. She thought about that sometimes. She thought about how the house had changed around him in direct proportion to how he had changed within it, and she was not entirely sure which was cause and which was effect, and she thought that might be the whole point. One evening in late August, he came to find her in the garden. She heard his boots on the path behind the kitchen house and looked up. He stood at the edge of the garden with his hat in his hands. "I have something to show you," he said. She wiped her hands on her apron and followed him inside and through the house to the front room, where he had moved the small side table she used for household correspondence and replaced it with a proper writing desk, solid oak, with a chair that fit it and a lamp positioned for the kind of long evening work she did. She stood and looked at it. "I had it brought from Cheyenne," he said. "It came in on the supply wagon yesterday. I wanted it to be a surprise, but I was never good at surprises, so I'm just showing you." She turned to look at him. "Thomas," she said. "You've been working at the kitchen table for 2 months," he said. "You need a proper desk." She looked at the desk, then back at him. "It's the finest piece of furniture in this house," she said. "That's appropriate," he said. And the matter-of-factness of it landed on her like something warm and blunt, because he meant it with no performance attached to it, and that made it more than any speech would have been. She crossed the room, and she put her hand flat on the top of the desk, the good solid oak of it, and she felt him watching her from the doorway, and she thought about a train platform in Wyoming, and a man with calculations on his face, and a letter that had been designed to promise nothing. "Sit down," he said. "See how it fits." She sat down. It fit. "Good," he said. He went back outside. She sat at the desk for a while and looked at the front room. The room she had watched transform in small ways over 2 months. The broken-legged chair fixed and back in its place. The curtains taken down and washed until they were pale gold instead of gray, the floors oiled and quiet underfoot. Then she got up and went back to the garden because there was work to do. There was always work to do. That was the other thing she had come to understand about this life. The thing she had not found in the factory, or the boarding house, or the small gray spaces of her previous existence. The work here was endless, and it was hard, and it was real in the way that mattered, connected to the land, and to the people, and to something larger than any individual day. She had not known she was looking for that. She had thought she was looking for survival. She had found something considerably more than that. The trial began on a cold Monday in late November. Sarah sat in the second row of the courthouse in Silver Creek behind Thomas and Bill Henderson and Jim Lattimore and Frank Cole. 4 ranchers who had been defrauded across 3 years by a man who had looked at the valley and decided it was there for his taking. Hargrove made his opening argument with the precision of a man who had prepared extensively and who believed that preparation was sufficient. He was wrong. Because he had prepared for the evidence he knew about. He had not prepared for Sarah. She was called to testify on the second day. She walked to the stand in the plain dark dress she had worn on the train out of St. Louis, the best dress she owned, and she sat down, and she looked at the courtroom, and she saw in the faces around her the full range of responses she had spent her life collecting. The assessment, the adjustment, the recalibration. Let them look, she thought. Briggs's prosecutor, a young man named Walsh, who had spent a week with Sarah going over every detail of the evidence, led her through the testimony with a careful structure that she had helped him design. Starting with the first entry she had found, building through the pattern, the timeline, the test scheme from 14 months ago, the supplier names, the attorney's correspondence. She answered every question clearly and without embellishment and without flinching from the specifics, because the specifics were the truth, and the truth did not require decoration. Hargrove cross-examined her. He began with her credentials, which she had known he would. She had no formal training in accounting. She had no legal expertise. She was a woman who had come from a factory job to a mail-order marriage and had been in Wyoming for fewer than 4 months. She answered every question the same way. "That's correct," she said to each version of the question. And yet, Hargrove said, his voice carrying the particular patience of a man who was managing someone he considered lesser. "You claim to have identified a sophisticated financial scheme that my client's own bookkeeper missed." "The bookkeeper didn't miss it," she said. Hargrove paused. "I beg your pardon," he said. "The bookkeeper processed some of those payments," she said. "Whether he did so knowingly or was himself deceived is a separate question. But the pattern was there in the records. It was there to be seen by anyone who looked at the whole picture rather than individual transactions." "And what qualified you," Hargrove said, "to look at the whole picture?" She held his gaze. "Nobody told me not to," she said. The courtroom was very quiet. Walsh was on his feet, immediately pointing to the timeline she had constructed, taking the jury through it entry by entry. And Sarah watched the jurors' faces as they followed the logic of it. The careful built structure of a thing that was true, and that looked true because it was true. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Edward Caldwell was found guilty on 11 counts of fraud. Hargrove announced an intention to appeal before the verdict had fully settled in the room, but she watched his face when he said it, and she had enough experience reading faces to know that he knew the appeal was a formality. The evidence was too complete, the pattern too clear. Thomas was beside her when the verdict was read, and she felt him go very still for a moment, the way he went still when something large was settling into place. And then she felt his hand find hers there in the courtroom in front of Bill Henderson and Jim Lattimore and Sheriff Briggs and half of Silver Creek Valley. He held on. She held on back. That winter was the best winter Silver Creek Ranch had seen in 7 years. Thomas said that. He said it at supper in late January, with the snow deep outside and the kitchen warmer than it had ever been, and 8 men around the table talking with the ease of people who had been somewhere long enough to feel they belonged. Best winter in 7 years, he said, and he was not talking about the weather. Daniel Cross had been promoted to foreman. He was 23 years old and serious about it in the way of young men, given responsibility, they intend to deserve. And he had a habit of stopping by the kitchen in the evenings to ask Sarah questions that were not always about the household, and that she answered honestly because he was a person who would do something useful with honest answers. Pete stayed through the winter, when everyone had expected him to head south as he usually did, and when Thomas asked him why, Pete said, "Better food," and left it at that, and Sarah accepted the compliment with the same equanimity she tried to bring to everything. Hank came to her in December. He came to the kitchen on a Sunday morning when the house was quiet and knocked on the door, even though it was his kitchen once, and waited for her to answer before he came in. He had been drinking less. She had noticed it the way she noticed most things, quietly and without commenting until there was something worth saying. He stood in the kitchen with his hat in both hands, which she recognized as the gesture of a man who was doing something that cost him. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Whitaker," he said. She looked at him. "You were unkind to me when I arrived," she said. "That's true." "Yes, ma'am." "You were also frightened," she said, "of losing your place, of change, of a woman who walked in and wasn't what anyone expected." He looked at the floor. "You got some of your own back," he said. "I deserve that." "That's not what I was doing," she said. "I was explaining. There's a difference." He looked up. "The bread you taught Ellie to make," he said. Ellie was the young woman from town who had started coming 3 mornings a week to help with the household. "That's my mother's method. I don't know how you knew it, but you're doing it the same way she did." Sarah looked at him. "My grandmother taught me," she said. "She learned it somewhere. Maybe it travels." His jaw worked. "It's a good kitchen now," he said. "I wanted you to know I see that." She picked up the coffee pot and poured him a cup and set it on the table. "Sit down, Hank," she said. "The cold's still in the air." He sat down. They drank coffee in the kitchen of Silver Creek Ranch and talked for 40 minutes about nothing more dramatic than the best way to keep a root cellar through a Wyoming winter, and when he left, he looked lighter than he had since she'd arrived, and she thought that was worth something. She was at her desk that evening, the oak desk in the front room that Thomas had brought from Cheyenne when he came to stand in the doorway. She looked up. "Good day," he said. It was not a question. "Good day," she agreed. He came into the room and sat in the chair near the window and stretched his legs out in the way of a man who was genuinely tired and genuinely comfortable, and she thought that the second part was newer than the first. "I had a letter from my sister in Ohio," he said. "She's been asking about the ranch." "What did you tell her?" "That things have changed," he said. She asked how. "What did you say?" He was quiet for a moment. "I told her I'd married someone," he said, and that the word married didn't quite cover what had happened. She set down her pen. She looked at him in the lamplight. This man who had written her a letter designed to expect nothing, who had stood on a train platform, doing calculations, who had come to find her in the kitchen on the 3rd night and asked what she had seen in his face. "That's an honest answer," she said. "I've been practicing," he said. She almost laughed. It surprised her the almost laugh came up faster than she'd anticipated, and she let it come because the warmth in his voice deserved it. "Thomas," she said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "When I answered your letter," she said, "I told you I was not afraid of Wyoming, and I was not afraid of hard work. That was true. But I was afraid of something." He waited. "I was afraid that I had waited too long," she said. "That I had spent so many years surviving the way people looked at me, that I had forgotten how to want something for myself, how to want a life that was mine, and not just an arrangement." She paused. "I came here telling myself it was practical. I told myself it was only about survival." "And now," he said. She looked at him. "Now I know that what I built here is mine," she said. "This kitchen, this household, this evidence we built together at that table, the garden, the hands who stayed, all of it." She stopped. "And you." His face did something she had never seen it do before, not the adjustment, or the recalibration, or the careful controlled responses of a man managing what he let himself feel. Something open and unguarded and real, the face of a man who has just been given something he had stopped believing was available to him. He stood up. He crossed the room. He stood in front of her, the way he had stood that afternoon in the kitchen, with the evidence on the table between them, with everything in the open, and he took her face in both hands, calloused and warm, and he kissed her. The first time. Right there in the front room, with the lamp burning, and the snow outside, and the rest of the house quiet around them. When he stepped back, he looked at her with his hands still framing her face, and he said quietly, and without any performance in it at all, "Sarah, you are the best thing that ever came to this ranch." She put her hands over his. "I know," she said, not with arrogance, not with false modesty either. Just the plain, hard-won knowledge of a woman who had always known her own worth, who had carried that knowledge through 25 years of a world that wanted to convince her otherwise, and who had arrived in Wyoming with one suitcase and set it down in a place that was finally completely hers. Spring came the way it always did in Wyoming, sudden and fierce and without apology, and Silver Creek Ranch met it differently than it had met any spring in years. The hands were full and steady and loyal. The records were clean. The garden was already showing the first green edges of what would be the largest growing season Sarah had attempted yet. Daniel Cross was riding the fence lines with the confidence of a young foreman who had found his footing. Pete was still there, and at supper every night the table was full. One evening in late April, Bill Henderson came for supper with Margaret, and Jim Lattimore came, and Frank Cole and his wife, and the table in the Silver Creek dining hall was crowded in a way it had not been since Thomas's mother had been alive. Thomas sat at one end, and Sarah sat at the other, and between them there was food and noise, and the particular warmth of people who had been through something hard together, and had come out the other side still standing. Margaret Henderson leaned over to Sarah at one point, and said low and warm, "You know what they call you in town?" Sarah looked at her. "I'm afraid to ask." "The heart of Silver Creek," Margaret said. "That's what people are saying, that you're the heart of it." Sarah looked down the long table. At Thomas, who was laughing at something Bill Henderson had said, a real laugh, unguarded the laugh of a man who had found his way back to himself. At Daniel talking with Jim Lattimore's foreman with the seriousness of a young man taking his place in the world. At Pete eating in his quiet way present, and at home. At all of it. She had arrived with one suitcase. She had arrived in a town that laughed at her, to a man who had not expected her, to a house that had forgotten what it was for. She had not been wanted. She had not been welcomed. She had not been seen. But she had known even then what she carried. She had always known. No crowd of strangers on a train platform. No cruel whisper. No assessing look. No man's calculations about her worth had ever touched the center of what she knew about herself. She looked at Thomas, and he looked back at her from the other end of the table, and the whole room was between them, and it did not matter. She was not the bride nobody wanted. She was the woman who had turned a cold, failing, empty place into a home, who had saved it from a man who tried to take it apart, who had built something real and lasting out of a transaction that was supposed to be nothing more than practical. She was the heart of Silver Creek Ranch, and she had earned every single beat of it.